Hi there, friends. This is Tom Munson of the Sioux City Public Museum, and this morning we're going to be talking about one of my favorite styles of architecture, Richardsonian Romanesque. Yeah, I know it's a lot of syllables, but you're going to hear me say it a lot, so just sit back and get used to it. We are going to start today by finding out what is Richardsonian Romanesque. That happy-looking chap there on the right, well, that's Henry Hobson Richardson, and we'll get to him in just a minute. Richardsonian Romanesque is a design movement at the end of the 19th century, and in this era, the United States architects were attempting to form a uniquely American style of architecture instead of borrowing on older European styles. The style in the late 19th century became incredibly popular, especially here in the Midwest, because this region was growing so quickly. So from north to south, all across the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, this movement was growing, and it was very popular in public buildings and churches. So, about Mr. Richardson. He was a prominent architect based in Boston, Massachusetts, and he's among the recognized trinity of American architects, along with others like Louis Sullivan, who was popular for Sullivanesque style architecture in the early part of the 20th century, and Frank Lloyd Wright, who's most renowned for developing Prairie School architecture, also in the first decade of the 20th century. Hobson was born in 1838 in Louisiana. He studied civil engineering at Harvard and Tulane universities. He went on to Paris and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the prominent school of architecture in the world in this era. He began to define his Romanesque style in the late 1860s with the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane, and that was in Buffalo, New York. His style solidified with the Trinity Church in Boston, Massachusetts in 1872. Before his untimely death in 1886, other monuments include the Albany City Hall, Seaver Hall at Harvard University, and the Marshall Field Warehouse in Chicago. The images you see right now include the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane. That's the building you see on the left. At the top of the screen on the right, you see Richardson's masterpiece, which is the Trinity Church in Boston, Massachusetts. And in the lower portion of the screen, you can see his Marshall Field Warehouse in Chicago. So what are some of the defining characteristics of Richardsonian Romanesque architecture? So the elements include rounded top arches on windows, porches, and entrances, and those arches are often in groups. Here you can see on the right-hand side of your screen the First Congregational Church of Sioux City, and you can see the arches and groups of arches banded together. Another characteristic style of this architecture are rough ashlar, which means squared mortar joints masonry, but they also have rough surfaces on the public facades. Towers and turrets are both very common in this style of architecture. Squat columns, like the one you can see at the entrance of the First Congregational Church, these short columns are also quite typical of Romanesque architecture. Parapeted gables and dormers. What is a parapet? So a parapet is those outer walls that extend up beyond the roofline. So the angled roofline, if you see those roof lines not extending beyond the wall, that is a parapet. You'll also see, like in this case with the Congregational Church, steeply pitched roofs, greater than a 45-degree angle. And lastly, like you see in the church here, asymmetrical facades, so the building is not uniform from one side to another. What is Richardsonian Romanesque Part 3? The two images you see here are both later examples of Richardsonian Romanesque, and this is in the early era of the skyscraper. Both of these buildings are located in Chicago. So there's variation and adaptation from Chicago-based architecture firm of Burnham and Root, along with others, and this variation also includes a handful of Sioux City architects, and we'll talk about them in just a little bit. We still see the use of stone, because that's one of the key elements of Richardsonian Romanesque, but we also see expansive use of brick. While original Richardsonian Romanesque architecture used very few window openings, in this era of the skyscraper, we start to see larger window openings and more windows. And of course, this is the era of the skyscraper, so Richardsonian Romanesque, which is really much more of a squat or shorter style of architecture, it's rising in this era of the skyscraper. That's due in part to the engineering marvel that was structural steel, which for the first time allowed buildings to be built more than 10 or 12 stories in height when you were dealing with the former structure of wood, post, and beam construction. So let's take a look at some of these Sioux City buildings. We're going to start with a building that really isn't a Richardsonian Romanesque building, but you can start to see some of its elements. This is the Sioux City linseed oil mill, which was built in 1884. This is located at 2nd and Court Street and was built by contractors E.C. Wakefield and F.J. Sulzbach. Throughout this talk, I will mention some of the building materials if I know from where they came. In this instance, the foundation walls, you can see at the bottom of the building, these were built out of Mankato quartzite, and the brick in the upper building was produced locally by early brickmaker John Rochelle. Now this building, obviously you can see the key characteristic of this style, which are the arched windows. And of course that foundation out of Mankato quartzite is that rough-faced stone with squared mortar joints. But we also see in the center of your screen, the pointed gable end, it extends up beyond the plane of the roof. Therefore, it is a parapet wall. Again, throughout this talk, I'm going to talk about different contractors. In this case, let's take a look at E.C. Wakefield, who will see his name pop up again. Wakefield was born in Essex County, New York, and came to Sioux City in 1880. Now you can see below there are a handful of other projects. You just saw the linseed oil mill. He also built the city waterworks, the Martin Block, First Congregational Church, we will see that one again. Police headquarters, we'll see that one again. Security Bank building, well, we'll see that in just a couple of minutes. The second building we're going to take a look at is the Union Stockyards Company Exchange. This was located at 423 South Prospect Street and designed by prominent Sioux City architect E.W. Loft. Now again, we see here, this is not Richardsonian Romanesque in its fruition, but you do see the bands of arched windows and some rough cut stone, like in the window sills in the case of this structure. So looking at Edward Loft, who was one of our prominent architects here. He was born in Dubuque County, Iowa in 1856. He had no formal training, but newspaper accounts of the time said he had a natural inclination towards designing buildings. He came to Sioux City in 1881 and partnered with James Corey. Corey left the partnership and Loft practiced independently from 1883 to 1890. Unfortunately, Loft died an untimely death in July of 1890. He was only 33 years old. Some of his monuments include the Stockyards Exchange, which we just saw, the first 3 corn palaces here in Sioux City, the Bay State Block and Boston Block, which we'll see later on in this talk, as well as the Major Block and Plymouth Block and Iowa Block, which we will all see again in this talk. This is a Security Bank building built in 1887 on the north side of 4th Street. You can see there 419 4th Street. This building was designed by Charles Porter Brown and built by contractor E.C. Wakefield. You're starting to hear me repeat myself because here we see some of the key elements of Richardsonian Romanesque, including the rounded Roman-style arches. You also get to see some slightly pointed Gothic arches in this structure. You see the rough-cut face stone. You can even see in the center of that building between the second floor windows, there's a little gargoyle, and above the main entrance, there's a small serpent. These are also typical embellishments on a Richardsonian Romanesque building. Well, a little bit more about Charles Porter Brown, another one of my favorite Sioux City architects. He was born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1855. He was not a witch. He learned the practice of architecture there. He worked for a couple of other architecture firms, including E.E. Myers in Detroit, Michigan, Wilson Brothers of Philadelphia. He came to Sioux City during the very beginning of Sioux City's boom era of the 1880s. He came here in 1886. But like many other businesses in Sioux City, his suffered greatly during the Panic of 1893. He himself was institutionalized in 1895, but fortunately his business was taken over in 1893 by William McLaughlin. We'll hear more about William McLaughlin too. No, I'm not going to read all those, but you can see some of the many buildings that Brown designed here in Sioux City. We'll see in a little bit the Metropolitan Block, the Massachusetts, the Howell, the YMCA, the City Hall and Library, the Evans Block. Boy, we're going to see a lot of these again, so we're going to see Brown's name pop up again and again. John C. French built this house in 1888 at 1721 Rebecca Street. This is another Brown project, and the contractor was George Hobson. This is probably the best Richardsonian Romanesque style house in Sioux City. You can see the parapeted dormers, you can see the arched windows, and right there in the center of the front of the house you can see this great turret rising above the front porch. You can see towers on the corners, and you can see that large, on the left you can see that large bay tower on the left. Now, unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, this building does not have a Romanesque style front porch. It has a very, very Victorian stick style front porch. Taking a quick look at George Hobson. Hobson was born in England, where he learned the carpentry trade. He came to Sioux City in 1883 and was initially employed by contractor Fred Beck. Some of Hobson's projects include the French house, which we just saw, the United Bank building, which we'll see, the William Remsen Smith house, which we will see, and the Evans block, which we will see later on in this talk. The Mark's Joy building on the north side of 5th Street between Pierce and Nebraska was built in 1888. It was designed by E.W. Loft and built by contractor Fred Beck. Now, the image you can see on the left, this is not really a very Richardsonian Romanesque style building. We get some elements on the 4th floor windows. You can see the arched windows. But what I wanted to elaborate on was the front entrance, where you can see the rough cut stone, the name block above the main entrance. This is all very much Richardsonian Romanesque style design. Again, a building that's not quite Richardsonian Romanesque is the Pearl Street School, which was later renamed Bancroft School. It was built in 1889 at the corner of 11th and Pearl Street. Pearl Street in that area today is Grandview. This building was designed by E.W. Loft and built by Swedish contractor John A. Swanson. Looking at the building itself, you can see that what we're getting so used to, which are the rounded Roman arches, but in the dormers at the top of the building and in the tower, you can see parapeted walls and the steeply pitched roof. A little look at contractor John Swanson. He was born in Växjö, Sweden in 1853. Came to Sioux City. He was one of Sioux City's early Swedes arriving in the 1870s. We're not going to see actually any of his other buildings except for the Schenkberg block in this talk. The J.H. Bolton and Commercial State Bank block, built in 1889 at the corner of 4th and Nebraska, was designed by James W. Martin and built by contractor Frank Clark. Now this is a much better example of some Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. We can see the bands of arched windows on the 4th floor and on the larger arches on the 3rd floor. But check out that entrance right on the corner of 4th and Nebraska with the squat columns, the rough cut stone, and great rounded arches. And you can see the foundation wall on the right-hand side of your screen, all of that rough cut stone in contrasting color. That's quite a light colored stone with probably a darker colored brick. Well, I don't know what this building looked like in color because, like so many of other Sioux City downtown buildings, this burned in 1904. Taking a little look at James W. Martin. Martin was born in 1852. He came to Sioux City in 1885. He practiced architecture in Sioux City for a short time before moving to Detroit, Michigan in 1894. Some of his projects here in town include Unity Church, the Higman Block. We're going to see both of those later on in this talk. We're also going to see the Fred Beck Flats, St. Thomas Episcopal Church, and the Reinhardt Hotel and Flats. This is a C.J. Chamberlain livery, built in 1889 at 511 Nebraska Street. Again, not an overwhelmingly Richardsonian Romanesque building, but you do see the rounded arches there on the second floor, and around the main entrance of the building, you can see the squat columns and some rough-cut stone. The Arthur S. Garretson House, built in 1889 by one of Sioux City's perhaps most elite ever, most prominent citizens of all time. So this house was located at the corner of South St. Aubin and Morningside Avenue. This structure was built out of Sioux quartzite. In the black and white image, you can of course see the rounded Romanesque arches, the squat columns, the rough-cut stone. And in this case, I wanted to point out the stone you can see, the Sioux quartzite. This is a nice indication of what the color of the building was. You can see the pinkish hues. Many of the viewers may remember this house when it was years later the Morningside branch of the Sioux City Public Library. The Howell Block in downtown at 312 Nebraska Street was designed by Charles Porter Brown and was built by contractors J. E. Nason and Stephen W. Johnston. Again, we see the arches and the rough-cut stone. I don't want to sound like a broken record. You'll be able to see the elements if you can't already see them. The Iowa Block, built in 1889 at the corner of 5th and Pierce Streets, was designed by E.W. Loft and built by contractor the Hanson brothers. Again, we see this is a phenomenal Richardsonian Romanesque building. We have squat columns, we have bands of arches, we have rough-cut stone, we have variation in the stone textures up above the 6th floor windows and that great parapet wall extending around the entire public facades of this structure. Contractors Christian and William Hansen. Well, they came to Sioux City in the 1880s from Denmark. Among some of their projects were the Hills Block, Metropolitan Block, Iowa Block, Richardson House, the Leeds Stove Works, Silverhorn Packing, Fowler Packing, and 2 of the Boston Investment Company buildings. We're going to get to the Boston Investment Company in just a little bit. The Crewman Block, built in 1889 at the corner of 4th and Court Streets. Today, this is the Diving Elk Bar and Restaurant. This building was designed by architect Brown and built by contractors F.X. Babway and the Jenkinson brothers. Now again, this building is more Romanesque than anything else with the rounded Roman arches, but you can see above the first floor plate glass windows, there is just a little bit of rough cut stone. Talking about contractors, here's F.X. Babway. He was born in Canada in 1842, educated at Brothers College in Montreal. He apprenticed in New York, came to Sioux City in 1875. Among some of his projects are the Peavey Grand Opera House, the Metropolitan Block, the Badgerow Block. That's not the Badgerow building of today. That's one of Badgerow's earlier buildings, the Tacoma Block, which was also one of Badgerow's blocks, the Merchants Clubhouse, which we'll see in a little bit, and the Toy Building, which we will also see a little bit later on. The major block on today's historic 4th Street was built in 1889 at 1010 to 1012 4th Street. This building was designed by E.W. Loft and built by contractors F.X. Babway and Stephen W. Johnston. We're getting used to the rounded Romanesque arches and the rough-cut stone, which you can see the rough-cut stone around the first floor entrances and those bands of arched windows on the 3rd floor. The Metropolitan Block once stood at the corner of 4th and Jackson Streets. It was built in 1889, designed by Charles Porter Brown, and its contractors were F.X. Babway and the Hanson brothers and Stephen W. Johnston. Like a lot of other buildings, this is not purely a Richardsonian Romanesque building. This is a Romanesque building. You can see on the 5th floor the rounded Roman arches, but on the corner you can see the turret or tower as it rises from the 2nd floor beyond the 6th floor. Much like the Mark's Joy block, which we saw earlier, I wanted to draw attention to the image on the right, and you can see those Richardsonian Romanesque arches, which are the squat columns and the rough-cut stone. Unity Church at the corner of 10th and Douglas was built in 1889. It was designed by architect J.W. Martin and built by contractor Aaron Halseth. Once again, we can see the rounded Roman arches and the rough-cut stone. Taking a look, this is contractor Aaron Halseth, born in Norway in 1845. He came to Sioux City in 1869. Along with being a contractor, he was president of several Sioux City businesses, including one of our longest named brick companies, the Sergeant Bluff and Sioux City Terracotta Brick and Tile Company. Some of his projects include Sioux City's first Union Depot, Sioux City's first high school building, the John Pierce House, the Unitarian Church, which we just saw, and the rest of them, the First Baptist, Silverhorn, and Union Stockyards, he built those too, but we're not talking about those. The Boston Investment Company. So I already alluded to it just a little bit. Sioux City is quickly growing in this era. Sioux City grew from a population of about 7,500 people in 1880 to about 20,000 in 1885 to nearly 62,000 in 1893. And this style of architecture was immensely popular, so there's a lot of building in this style going on in Sioux City. One of the companies responsible for that was the Boston Investment Company, which had really been started by A.S. Garretson to attract Eastern money to Sioux City for the development of this city. It's no surprise then that the buildings of this investment company all bear New England names, including the Bay State, Massachusetts, Lexington, Boston, and Plymouth. The image you see here is out of a small publication that was actually published before any of these buildings were designed and built. So it turns out the buildings we're going to see, though they have these names, really don't look a whole lot like their illustrations, except for the Lexington block there in the center. The Bay State block, built in 1890 on the north side of 4th Street between Court and Iowa Street, was designed by E.W. Loft and built by contractor E.C. Wakefield. This building is out of Ohio gray sandstone. And I just want to show you a color now because this building is still standing. And here's a picture I took just a few days ago. It really doesn't look gray. It's kind of tan. But nevertheless, this image, you can get a nice close-up detail of some of the architecture of this building. Those rounded Roman arches, that rough-cut stone, and in the towers that you can see on either side of the central window bays, and of course the Bay State block nameplate at the top of this building. The Boston block was also built by the Boston Investment Company in 1890. This is at 1105 4th Street. The architect here is E.W. Loft. One thing I want to note about some of these Boston Investment Company buildings is their use of a new structural construction in the use of structural steel. You can see that massive stone, that massive weight is supported by seemingly nothing but glass. But you also have a structural steel skeleton inside of that building. Structural steel is very strong and is able to hold up the vast amounts of weight that are above it. So this was kind of a new age in construction and allowed buildings, not only in Sioux City, but in places like Chicago and New York City, to extend beyond 10 or 12 floors. You can see a very similar design motif in the Massachusetts block, also built in 1890. This is at the corner of 4th and Jackson, where the Badgerow building now stands. Although it looks very similar to the Boston block, which you just saw, this has a totally different architect. We're back to Charles Porter Brown and contractor Stephen W. Johnston. Again, though, you can see the structural steel frame on the first 2 floors supporting a massive stone structure above. Of course, we can see the fourth floor arched windows and the rough cut stone all the way around. Just as a note, this building is where the Pelletier fire of 1904 began. The Plymouth Block on historic 4th Street was built in 1890. This is at the corner of 4th and Court Street. It was designed by E.W. Loft and built by contractor Stephen W. Johnston. Now this building is almost entirely Romanesque and very little Richardsonian. There's only a little bit of rough cut stone at the bottom of the piers along the first floor, and there's a little bit of rough cut stone above the 4th floor windows. This building is really starting to begin a totally new era of architecture, which is Sullivanesque, which is emerging at this same time in 1890 in Chicago by architect Louis Sullivan. So E.W. Loft was really right on in the upper tier of architects as he was practicing what was going on in much larger leading cities. The Evans Block, built in 1890, is perhaps Sioux City's best example of commercial Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. This building at the corner of 4th and Iowa was designed by Charles Porter Brown and built by contractors Hawken A. Johnson, the Hanson brothers, John Gillespie, and George Hobson. We're going to take a close-up look at the main entrance of this building right here. So this is just a fantastic Richardsonian Romanesque entryway. The arch, the rough-cut stone, and the squat columns. Now, of course, this building is a light-colored stone, so you can still see some of the age, the black soot that still surrounds some of this building, which was recently restored, but about 20 years ago, an attempted restoration had sandblasted some of the surface, so there is some significant damage to some of the stone. Evans stone. We just saw the Evans block. It is built out of Evans stone, that light-colored brick block we saw. Well, it's not a coincidence. We're taking a look at it right now. Fred T. Evans Jr. came to Sioux City with his family in 1871. In 1875, he and others organized the Black Hills Transportation Company. By the 1880s, Evans was developing the Hot Springs, Dakota Territory area, including the hot springs located there and regional sand quarries. If you've ever been to the Black Hills and heard of Evans Plunge, well, it was named for Evans. Evans was a major developer in the hot springs area. So the sandstone, at least here in Sioux City and in this area around Sioux City, became known as Evans stone. And it was used in several local buildings, including the City Hall and Library building, the Evans building, which we just saw, the Hotel Gordon, which we will not see, the Swan Block. We will see the Union Depot in a little bit, and we saw it way back when we were talking about the Mark's Joy Block as well. This is the building we saw right at the beginning of the talk when we were talking about the elements, because as far as churches go, this is the most Richardsonian Romanesque church, and possibly the most Richardsonian Romanesque building ever in Sioux City history. So this is the First Congregational Church at the corner of 8th and Nebraska. This structure was designed by George Gunn Baldwin and built by contractor E.C. Wakefield. We already have seen so many of the elements before, but again we see it here: the rounded Roman arches, the rough-cut stone, the squat columns, the towers, the parapet walls, and the steeply pitched roof. A little bit about George Gunn Baldwin. He was born in Connecticut in 1830. He came to Sioux City in 1871 and died here at the end of 1891. Some of his projects include the Higman Block, Beck Block, C.R. Marks House, Manley House, Hopkins School, and banker T.J. Stone's house. It's interesting, George Gunn Baldwin is also one of the more recent additions to our Floyd Cemetery tour. Hint, hint, hint. The Central Stockyards Company Exchange, a new one built in 1890, was designed by architect William McLaughlin. Now this is very much a Romanesque style building with bands of rounded Roman arches and isn't really Richardsonian at all. but we'll get to that in just a moment. Let's take a look first to talk about William McLaughlin, who was born in Baltimore, Maryland in the 1860s. He apprenticed in his hometown under E.G. Lind. He worked in the engineering department of the Great Northern Railroad, helping to design depots and freight depots and other railroad infrastructure. He came to Sioux City in 1890 to work for E.W. Loft. But remember, Loft died only 3 weeks later in 1890. McLaughlin himself died in 1897 from a laudanum overdose. Yikes. Loft died, Brown died, and now McLaughlin died. Well, let's face it, these are architects from 140 years ago. They're all dead now. So among some of McLaughlin's projects were the Central Stockyards Company, Longfellow School, the L.Z. Burkham House, St. Joseph Church, which we'll see later on, the Continental Block we'll see, as will we see the Lindholm Building, and the Shepherd Flats. This is the Sioux City Stockyards Company, the same building with a new annex added on in 1900. Here we can see around the foundation wall, we can see the rough cut stone. We can see a tower and turret, and we can see more rounded Romanesque arches. So a building that was only vaguely Richardsonian Romanesque, now with the addition of an addition, becomes much more Richardsonian Romanesque. This addition was designed by George W. Burkhead. So Burkhead, he was born here in Iowa in 1858. He studied architecture in high school in Independence, Iowa. He came to Sioux City during the height of our boom era in 1890. Among some of his projects include the Livestock Exchange Annex, and that whole other list doesn't include another Romanesque building, so you can read it at your leisure. John Milton Porbaugh built this house in 1890 at 1631 South Paxton Street. This structure was designed by Charles Porter Brown and built by the owner, who was a contractor, John Milton Porbaugh. Here's a color image of this house, and this is where I want to bring something to your attention, that even though these buildings were all stone, sometimes multiple colored stones were employed. So you can see overall, this house is built out of a pinkish color stone, but if you look at the front porch wall, you can see that is a slightly more red stone, and above that, the columns rise to kind of a brown colored decorative stone, which supports those arches along the top of the porch. But I want to take a look at John Milton Porbaugh himself, who was born in Indiana in the 1850s. He learned the masonry trade at a young age. This is where he becomes infamous. He began quarry operations in Dell Rapids, Dakota Territory in 1888. He came to Sioux City in 1889. While at the same time, he's establishing the Red Pipestone Quarry Company in Pipestone, Minnesota. He founded the town of Jasper, Minnesota, along with others, and he founded the Sioux Valley Stone Company of Sioux City and Jasper in 1890. He took over quarry operations at Garretson, South Dakota in 1891. Some of his projects here in Sioux City include the University of the Northwest, which is today Morningside College, St. Thomas Episcopal Church, the Union Depot, Continental Block, and of course his own house. All of these are in this talk. But why is Porbaugh so important? Take a look at the background of this screen and you'll see that pink colored stone that we've already seen several times before in this talk. Well, he's the guy who was quarrying this stuff in areas of South Dakota and Minnesota. If you see below, you can see one of his quarries in Minnesota. And now taking a look at the right-hand side of the screen, what you see there is that the red line is a railroad that runs from Pipestone through Jasper, through Dell Rapids, right down into Sioux City. So Porbaugh is quarrying this stone, and it's being sent here to Sioux City to build up this city's architectural significance during the 1890s and 1880s. Kind of a minor project is the William Roberts livery, built in 1890 at 609 Douglas. It's kind of one of those buildings that is vaguely Richardsonian Romanesque. We do have bands of arch windows, and just above those window sills, the window lintels are rough cut stone. The Sioux City Journal building added on to its plant in 1890, and they include this building at 415 Douglas Street. We can see a couple of small rounded Roman arches, and you can see above those, above the top of the third floor, a balustrade composed of squat columns and small Romanesque arches. The Toy Building, built in 1890. This is one of my favorite all-time Sioux City buildings. This was located at the corner of 4th and Jackson Street, designed by architects Fisher and Russell, and built by contractor FX Babway. You start to think after a while, because you see these images in black and white, that everything is built out of gray stone. Well, in this case, the toy block was built out of ported red sandstone from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. You can see a picture of that at the bottom. This is, well, along one of the Great Lakes. I'm not exactly sure which one, because it could be any one of a couple. Just as an interesting historical note, this was Sioux City's tallest building from 1890 to 1897. The United Bank building was located at 5th and Jackson Street, built in 1890. It was designed by out-of-town architects Mendelson, Fisher, and Lowry from Omaha, Nebraska. The contractor for this building was George Hobson. There comes a point when I don't even need to talk about what some of these elements are, because again, I'm starting to sound like a broken record. Rounded Roman arches, rough-cut ashlar stone. We get to see all of it here. The University of the Northwest started in 1890. They also initiated a couple of building projects that year. Of course, you probably haven't heard of the University of the Northwest because it went kaput in 1893 and was reorganized as Morningside College in 1894. The central illustration features a couple of their speculated buildings, and I've blown those up on either side of the screen so you can see the College of Liberal Arts on the left and the College of Technology on the right. Both of these buildings designed in the Richardsonian Romanesque style. Only one of these buildings was actually ever built as designed, or partially as designed. This is the University of the Northwest College of Technology, built in 1890 by designed by architect Brown, built by contractor Poorbaugh, out of that pink-colored Sioux quartzite. This building is still standing today and is Charles City Hall on the Morningside College campus. Here's an image of Poorbaugh's workmen building this structure. Some of those stones you can see in the foreground are quite large. I should note that these, I did just a little bit mention how large some of these stones are. So quartzite as a stone weighs about 175 pounds per cubic foot. So I'm just doing some real quick math in my head right now. Assuming the big stone you can see there in the bottom left hand side of your screen is about 2 by 2 by 10. I'm not good at math. Needless to say, it weighs tons. The University of the Northwest also had tentatively planned to build the Garretson Observatory. It was designed by Charles Porter Brown, but never built. I mentioned this building quite a ways back. These are the Fred Beck Flats, built in 1891, just south of 13th Street on Pierce. They were designed by architect J.W. Martin and built by contractor Fred Beck. Hence, they are the Fred Beck Flats. Things we have seen many times before: rounded Roman arches, rough-cut stone, steeply pitched roofs, and even a tower right there in the center. Hawthorne School in Leeds was built in 1891 at 44th and Central Streets. So, when this building was initially announced, the school district said it would be built out of one of 3 different stones. It could have been built out of Kasota stone, brownstone, or Evans stone. Well, none of those are the case, and we can see there's some trim there that looks like it may have been done in Evans stone, but most of the building is just clad in brick. It was probably a cost-saving measure, but you can see some of the elements of this building are very much Richardsonian Romanesque, like the rounded tower you can see there on the left-hand side of the screen, the rounded Roman arches, and the rounded Roman arches on the dormer on the right-hand side. The Andrew V. Larimer House in Morningside was built in 1891 at 2105 South St. Aubin Street. Now, only a little bit of this is Richardsonian Romanesque, and that's mostly confined to the porches, but you can see the light-colored rough-cut stone. That is Evans stone, once again. The Merchants Clubhouse at 412 5th Street was built by contractor John Gillespie and F.X. Babway. Again, I mentioned not all these buildings are built of gray stone, even though they're depicted in black and white images. This structure was built out of red sandstone. Even though this is an extraordinarily fine example of Richardsonian Romanesque with the banded arched windows, the arched entryways, squat columns, the beautiful parapeted dormer above the 4th floor. It's just a really neat building. And this photo, I didn't do it in this talk, but it's so fun to zoom in and see some of the intricately carved stone around that entrance to this building. Here's a building a lot of you will recognize. This is the John Pierce House, built between 1891 and 1893 at 2901 Jackson Street. Blah, blah, blah. This was a longtime home of the Sioux City Public Museum. The building was designed by Charles Porter Brown and built by contractor Aaron Halseth. Another house, if you're a Sioux Citian, you might recognize, is the William Element House, built in 1892 at the corner of 19th and Jackson Streets. I took this picture a couple of years ago when I was walking to work one day. Again, you can see the great rounded Roman arches, kind of the little bit of turrets and the parapeted walls in the dormer and gable ends. The City Hall and Library building was built in 1892. This was at the corner of 6th and Douglas Street, designed by Brown and built by contractor E.C. Wakefield. This is another one of those structures that was built out of Evans stone. This slide is just a close-up of the east entrance of the building. You can see the squat columns near the bottom of the screen and that kind of recessed balcony. You can see the turrets rising out of the facade walls and the rounded Roman arches and more of the rough-cut stone. The Pierce Street block was never built. It was allegedly to be along Pierce Street, is all I know. But you can see this is very similar to a lot of the other buildings we've seen in this talk. There, the third floor level, you can see the bands of arched windows, as well as at the 7th floor. Had this been built, this would have been certainly Sioux City's largest downtown commercial structure, 150 feet deep and 316 feet long. The Reinhardt Hotel and Flats were built in 1892 at 7th and Nebraska. They were designed by J.W. Martin and built by contractor Frank Clark. Once again, we see the tower, parapet walls, rounded Roman arches. It's hard to see because this is a drawing, but in the very poor photographs we have of this building, you can see there is some rough-cut stone. The Schenkberg building was built in 1892 and 1894. The first 4 floors were built in 92, the top 2 floors in 1894. This building was located at 3rd and Pierce Street, and either one of those buildings does not really contain Romanesque architecture until you put it together. You can see along the 1st floor of the building there's some rough-cut stone, but going up to the top of the 4th floor, there are no arches. It wasn't until the 6th floor was added where you have arches that this becomes a vaguely Richardsonian Romanesque building. Probably one of the most identifiable Sioux City buildings is Sioux City High School, built in 1892. This is probably the best known example of Sioux City's Richardsonian Romanesque, or Norman style architecture. This building was designed by F.S. Allen of Joliet, Illinois, and built by contractor Eric Lund of Minneapolis, Minnesota. The building was built out of Prentice brown sandstone from Lake Superior area in Minnesota. Sioux City High School was added onto in 1913 and 1914 in a design by Frank E. Colby. Of course, in keeping with the earlier architecture, Colby and the school district decided to have the new addition of the building built in the style of the existing building, so we just get a much larger Richardsonian Romanesque style building. It's interesting, the quarry from which the stone came, from which the original building had been built, had closed. That quarry had to be reopened to get the right color of stone to Sioux City to build this addition. Another recognizable building is the William Remsen Smith House, built in 1892 at 16th and Rebecca Streets. It was designed by architect Fred M. Sterling and built by contractor George Hobson. Of course, a lot of people will recognize this building because only 7 years after it was built, this became Smith Elementary School. Let's take a moment to talk about Fred Miller Sterling. He was born in Fayette, New York in the 1840s. He came to Sioux City in 1873 and began his career as an architect and builder here in 1886. Some of his projects include the building we just saw, the Smith House, Mayflower Congregational Church, the J.C.C. Hoskins House, the William Kiefer House. Well, all of these houses are on Rebecca Street or on the west side. Sterling designed dozens of houses in the Smith Villa area. Again, going back to this house, here we can see a very interesting photo of the building under construction. And finally, because this became a school, expansion was necessary, so the building was added onto in 1910 by George W. Burkhead. Again, we kept up with that Richardsonian Romanesque style design, and this building is beginning to look a lot more like it would for the generations of students who attended this school. St. Thomas Episcopal Church. Boy, it's almost a tie between this and First Congregational Churches to which is the most adherent Richardsonian Romanesque building. This structure at the corner of 12th and Douglas, built in 1892, was designed by J.W. Martin and built by contractor John M. Poorbaugh out of a new kind of stone, gray granite, from Jasper, Minnesota. So this is actually a quartzite, but instead of being pinkish, it's just a little bit more gray, and it's not really granite at all. We're getting so used to the elements of this style: rounded Roman arches, parapet walls, steeply pitched roofs, towers, asymmetry. This building has it all. It has it all, including a great photo of the construction. The guy standing in the upper right-hand corner, that is our contractor, John M. Poorbaugh. And because this is such a fantastic building, even though this isn't the greatest image, this really shows the conical turret, the conical tower around the altar of this church. This is the south facade of the building, and just is another view of the interesting Romanesque aspects of the structure. Sioux City Police Headquarters, built in 1892 at 209 3rd Street by contractor E.C. Wakefield, was also designed in the Richardsonian Romanesque style. The Security Bank Building. There's not a whole lot of Romanesque, but there's a whole lot of Richardson going on in this building, built in 1893 at the corner of 4th and Nebraska Street. This building was designed by Daniel Hudson Burnham, who was one of Chicago, Illinois' most prominent architects. So it was really a phenomenal occurrence that he designed our Security Bank Building here in Sioux City. Now, the structure was supervised, the construction of the structure was supervised by local architect William McLaughlin and built by contractor E.C. Wakefield. This structure was built out of Lake Superior brownstone. the same stone that was used to build Sioux City High School. The Union Depot at 3rd and Douglas Street was built in 1893. It was designed by Kansas City architects Van Brunt and Howe and J.A.L. Waddell. The building was built by contractors John M. Poorbaugh and Aaron Halseth, this building out of Garretson stone and red pipestone. I'm not exactly sure what Garretson stone is, but I'm guessing they meant quartzite from the Garretson, South Dakota area. And again, like we saw way back with the Poorbaugh house, you can see just a little bit of variation in the color. The arches on this building are just a little bit darker than the field stone. So the field stone was probably a lighter colored stone, and that red pipestone decoration was really a contrasting element. The Young Men's Christian Association was designed in the Richardsonian Romanesque style. You can see what the building was conceived to be in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. This was located at 7th and Pierce Street and designed by Charles Porter Brown. But we're getting later on in the 1890s, and the Depression is starting to have its effects. Money is becoming tighter, so we can see this building around the foundation was built out of a stone, a rough-cut stone, and the building was finished in just regular pressed brick. But still, this is quite adherent to the Richardsonian Romanesque principles of design. St. Joseph Catholic Church was built in 1893 at the corner of 8th and Iowa Streets. It was designed by Walker and Eisentraut and William McLaughlin. Again, arched windows, steep pitched roofs, parapet walls, and towers. I wanted to take a look. This is the north facade of St. Joseph Catholic Church, and here you get to really see some of that pink quartzite in play. The Masonic Temple was built at the corner of 5th and Douglas Street in 1894, designed by architect William McLaughlin and contractor John M. Poorbaugh. Again, we see here money is becoming tighter, so expensive elements like stone are being used with less frequency, but you can still see the entrance at the center of this photograph still is a rounded Roman arch, squat columns, and the rough-cut stone. The Lindholm Building was built in 1894 at the corner of 5th and Douglas, designed by architect William McLaughlin. The Shepherd Flats were also designed by McLaughlin and built in 1894, just south of 12th and Pierce Streets. There's just a little bit of Richardsonian Romanesque in those rounded Roman arches and rough-cut stone. An addition was put on this building in 1904, and again, we see the addition of a tower. That's a very Richardsonian Romanesque element, and the rounded Roman arch as well. The United States Federal Building was completed in 1897 at 6th and Douglas Street. This building was designed by W.J. Edbrook and locally supervised by architect William McLaughlin. It was built out of Bedford limestone. Again, this style was very popular in public buildings like courthouses and city halls. Here's a photo of the building under construction. The Malone Building at 5th and Pearl Street was built in 1899, designed by architect George W. Burkhead. The first floor of this building is implemented in rough-cut stone, and you can see the bands of arched windows on the second floor. The Sioux City Brewery, built in 1899 at West 3rd and Wesley Way, is also exhibiting some Richardsonian Romanesque. We have the rounded Roman arches, and around the base of the building you can see some of that rough-cut stone. St. Joseph Hospital, built in 1900 at 21st and Court Street, has rounded Roman arches, rounded towers, a parapeted dormer, and again you can see the rough-cut stone around the lower foundation walls of this structure. In addition to that hospital, in 1912, came up with the same design aesthetic of Richardsonian Romanesque with the rough-cut stone and rounded Roman arches and parapeted dormers. The Abel Anderson House has all sorts of Richardsonian Romanesque building materials, but not very much else. No rounded arches. We're kind of coming to the end of popularity for Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. This structure is located at the corner of 9th and Jennings. St. Peter Lutheran Church, built in 1901 at 6th and Virginia. You can see the rounded Roman arches, the steeply pitched roof, and parapeted walls, and rough-cut stone. Tollerton and Stetson Warehouse, built in 1901, designed by Henry Fisher. Again, we can see the rough-cut stone around the first floor and the bands of arched windows around the 5th and 6th floors. The Szymanski Building on Pearl Street was built in 1904, designed by architect G.W. Burkhead. Once again, we can see the rounded Roman arches, and at the corner of this building we can see just a little bit of rough-cut stone. The Alfred Hallam House, built in 1905 at 1524 Summit Street, is entirely clad in stone, and we can see there in the parapeted dormer one arched window. And rounding out our talk is a new toy building built after the 1904 Pelletier fire destroyed the 1890 toy building. We see just a plain old box, but it's built out of Richardsonian Romanesque style stone. Well, I want to thank you guys for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this dive into Richardsonian Romanesque. Again, it's my favorite style. I know we saw a lot and we covered a lot of ground, but I want to thank you for joining me. Enjoy. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns or comments. Thanks.